There's a real Irish pub sitting underneath Air Force One at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. It's not a reproduction, it's not a movie set, a real pub that once stood thousands of miles away in a small village in County Tipperary, Ireland. And in the summer of 1984, Ronald Reagan walked through its doors, raised a pint of Smithwick ale, and became part of its history. Today, I want to tell you how that little Irish pub made its way from Ballyporeen, Ireland, all the way to Simi Valley, California, and why it's one of my favorite overlooked stories here at the library. In June 1984, President Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan traveled to Ireland, but one stop on that trip was deeply personal. Genealogical research had traced part of the Reagan family history to the small village of Ballyporeen in County Tipperary. His great-grandfather, Michael Reagan, had come from this area before emigrating to America in the 1800s. So on June 3rd, 1984, Marine One brought the President and Mrs. Reagan to Ballyporeen, and the village was ready for him. The streets were decorated, residents gathered to welcome their American visitors, and this little Irish community suddenly found itself at the center of international attention. For President Reagan, however, this wasn't another diplomatic stop. This was a chance to stand in the place where part of his family's American history had begun. During the visit, President Reagan viewed the baptismal record of his great-grandfather, attended a prayer service at the local Church of the Assumption, met residents of the village, and received a copy of his family tree. And naturally, there was also a stop at the local pub. The pub belonged to John and Mary O'Farrell. It was already an old and well-established part of Ballyporeen when word came that the President of the United States would be stopping by. And in anticipation of the Reagan's visit, O'Farrell's became associated with a new name, the Ronald Reagan Pub. Inside, the president was handed a pint of Smithwick ale, and there are wonderful photographs in the Reagan Library archives of President and Nancy Reagan standing inside the pub, meeting the O'Farrells and posing for photographs. And for a few minutes, the President of the United States wasn't standing behind a podium or sitting across a table from another world leader. He was standing inside a small town Irish pub in the village his family had left generations before. To me, that's what makes this story so interesting. It connects the presidency with something much more personal. Family, ancestry, and that very human desire to understand where we came from. The pub continued operating in Ballyporeen for another 20 years, but in 2004 it closed. And that might have been the end of the story, except for a man named Frederick Ryan Jr. Fred Ryan had worked closely with President Reagan and later became chairman of the board of trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. During a trip to Ireland, Ryan visited Ballyporeen and discovered that the pub had closed. He contacted John and Mary O'Farrell, and eventually an agreement was reached to acquire much of the historic pub and preserve it at the Reagan Library. Now imagine what came next. The bar, the stools, the fixtures, the signs, the memorabilia. Much of the interior that had surrounded President and Mrs. Reagan during the visit in 1984 was carefully taken apart, packed into containers, and shipped thousands of miles from Ireland to here in Simi Valley. And it was reassembled again, not in some obscure corner of the museum, but on the lower level of Air Force One Pavilion. And today, visitors walking between one of the most recognizable presidential aircraft in American history can step into a little piece of Ballyporeen, Ireland. The Reagan Foundation describes it as the actual Irish pub visited during that 1984 trip, dismantled and shipped to America as part of the museum collection. And when you stand inside it, you understand what that means. The worn bar, the stools, the signage, the details. This isn't simply an exhibit designed to look old. Much of what you're seeing was actually there. And I had a wonderful experience that brought that home to me personally. As a docent here at the Reagan Library, I've had the opportunity to meet people who experienced some of these events firsthand. On one occasion, I had the opportunity to show the pub to a couple of Secret Service agents who'd accompanied President Reagan on that trip to Ireland. I was interested in their reaction. These weren't visitors looking at an exhibit for the first time. These were the men and women who remembered the actual place, and they were stunned by how accurately the pub had been recreated here in Simi Valley. For me, that was one of those moments when museum history suddenly becomes very real. You're not simply looking at something that represents where history happened. You're standing among pieces of the place where it actually happened. And yet, thousands of visitors can come through that Air Force One Pavilion, look up at that magnificent Boeing 707, walk through the presidential motorcade exhibit, and barely notice this little Irish pub sitting underneath it. I get it. I understand why. Air Force One, well, it tends to command your attention. But next time you're here, don't walk past the pub. Stop for a moment. Look at the bar. Look at the signs. Imagine Ballyporeen in June of 1984. The small Irish village waiting for a helicopter carrying the President of the United States. Imagine President Reagan walking through the door of O'Farrell's Pub, raising a glass in the village his great-grandfather once called home, and then think about the extraordinary journey that the pub itself would eventually make. From Ballyporeen, Ireland, across the Atlantic to Simi Valley, California, where more than 40 years later, people are still walking through its doors. I got to tell you, that's the kind of story I love finding, and I see so often here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. The things that can be easy to overlook often have some of the best stories behind them. I'm Frank Spencer, Mr. Chatsworth, and this has been another hidden story of the Reagan Library. And until next time, I'll see you around the neighborhood.